Good morning, friends. Donna Chase here, Director of Christian Formation at First Presbyterian Church. I'd like to invite you to our summer story time series that begins this week, the first week of June, and will continue through July. Our series is going to be focused on a collection of children's books that I have purchased over the last several years from the International Civil Rights Museum here in Greensboro. The books are for a variety of ages. Some would be appropriate for young children, preschool and up. Others are geared a little more for elementary and even older elementary. All of them are books that could also be enjoyed by youth and adults, and I hope actually that you will read these as a family, enjoy hearing them read, and maybe even order them if there's one that you are particularly fond of. Today, the story that I will be reading is called The Youngest Marcher. It's the story of Audrey Faye Hendricks, a young civil rights activist. Get ready to enjoy the story. Whenever Mike flew into town, Audrey and her mama cooked. Barbecued ribs, stewed greens, sweet potato souffle, and Audrey's favorite, hot rolls baptized in butter. Other folks knew Mike as Martin or Dr. King. The Hendrickses used his nickname. They did the same with other ministers too, like Fred Shuttlesworth and Jim Bevel. After Mike blessed the feast, Mama expected Audrey to keep still during supper. But when grown-ups talked about wiping out the segregation laws that kept black and white people apart in Birmingham, she just had to speak up. Audrey intended to go places and do things like anybody else. I want to eat my ice cream inside of Newberry's. I want to sit downstairs at the Alabama. I don't want hand-me-down school books. But stools at the counter, plush movie seats, books so fresh they'd crackle when you open them, those were for white children. Shh, said Mama. 9-year-old children should not speak in front of company, especially ministers like Fred and Mike and Jim, who were the bearers of justice. Audrey knew all about segregation. She knew how to pay the driver at the front of the bus and then step off and walk around to the back. She knew how to drink from the fountain of the dirty bowl and warm water, use the freight elevator at the department store downtown, front row seats, cool water, elevators with operators. No, those were for white folks. Every Monday night, Audrey and her mama and daddy and her aunts and uncles and cousins joined their neighbors and friends at Fred's church for worship, fellowship, and testimony. She sang and swayed along with the choir, her voice spirited and spiritual. Black and white together, we shall overcome. For once, she didn't have to keep still. Then came the testimonies. White store owners won't hire me. Ku Klux Klan chased me. Policemen called me names. The hateful stories made Audrey squirm, and she tried to tell her mama, that's not right. How could Mama expect her to be quiet? She had to make things right. But what could she do? When Mike visited Fred's church, thousands of people crowded around to hear him preach. In a voice as taut as steel cables, as smooth as glass, he intoned, segregation is morally wrong and sinful. That's true. Fired up Audrey sat taller. An unjust law is no law at all, he proclaimed. Audrey had listened to Mike explain his plan at her supper table and knew what he meant. If a law is unjust, disobey it, sit down inside Newberry's, picket those white stores, march to protest those unfair laws, then get arrested. Fill the jails, Mike exclaimed. Fill Birmingham's jails so full that policemen can't squeeze in one more person. Pack the cells so tight that the police will have to quit arresting people for demanding their rights. Audrey just knew Mike's plan would work. She twisted in her pew to see which grown-ups would walk down the aisle to volunteer for jail. But they mostly stayed put, eyes staring at their feet, hands on their knees. Feet, hands, and knees didn't move. Fill the jails, Mike pleaded, meeting after meeting. But the head shook. All around her, Audrey heard, no, best not to break those segregation laws. Boss man will fire me. Landlord will evict me. Policeman will beat me. If nobody protested, Mike's plan would fail. Police could keep arresting anyone, anytime, for anything, forever. Audrey would never be able to go places and do things like everybody else. One night, Jim announced a new idea. If the grown-ups won't do it, fill the jails with children. Audrey leapt to her feet. I want to go to jail, she declared. Mama looked deep and saw that Audrey's eyes begged please. Okay, Mama said. Audrey strutted down the aisle. She was going to jail. Two mornings later, she put on a fresh-pressed pinafore and shiny Mary Janes with turned-down socks. Protesters got to look nice, and in the meantime, her daddy bought her a game to help her pass the time in jail. Mom and Daddy took her by her school to tell her teacher she would be absent, maybe for a whole week. Miss Willis wrapped her arms around her. Audrey knew she was proud of her. She said goodbye to her grandparents. You'll be fine, her grandmother said. She knew Audrey would be brave. Then her mom and daddy drove her down to the 16th Street Baptist Church, where the children were all gathering. Even before she reached the door, Audrey heard loud voices chanting freedom songs. Inside, hundreds of big kids called out to friends and crowded around the signs for their high schools. Parker, Carver. Her head swiveled. Where was the sign for her Center Street Elementary School? She was the only protester from her school, the youngest child in the whole church, and she knew no one. Audrey huddled by her parents in the basement, but when Jim lined her up with the others, 2 by 2, the door swung open and Audrey straightened up. She was going to break a law and go to jail to help make things right. Clutching a protest sign in one hand and her game in the other, Audrey marched out the door. She stomped and sang, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round." Half a block from the church, a white policeman stopped Audrey and pointed toward a paddy wagon. Sentence, 1 week in juvenile hall. A matron locked Audrey into a day room with 24 other girls, all older, all bigger, all strangers. Audrey sat alone and slipped the cover off of her game. "I told you to sit down," the matron yelled. Audrey jumped. She didn't remember standing up. The matron dragged her to a dark, empty room. "When I tell you to do something, you do it," she commanded, "or I'll leave you here." Trembling, Audrey quietly followed the matron back to the day room, put away her game, lay down her head and cried. Jail was hard, much harder than she thought, and she was not fine at all. By evening, Audrey was hungry and tired. For dinner, soupy, oily, tasteless grits. At night, a bare mattress with one thin sheet to cover her. Audrey and her cellmates were led outdoors into an empty concrete pen surrounded by high prison walls. The older girls talked together, and Audrey wondered what her classmates were doing. Miss Willis would be keeping them busy. On another day, Audrey was sent to a huge room and told to sit in a chair that was so high her feet dangled above the floor. 4 white men glared at her. She'd never talked to a white man before. "Are you against America?" one demanded to know. "No, sir," she answered politely. "What do you talk about at those meetings?" another one asked. "We talk about freedom." "Why did you march?" "So that I can go places and do things like anybody else." What's wrong with that? Every mealtime, Audrey stared at greasy grits. She could barely spoon them into her mouth, let alone swallow them. And every night, the cot wire springs jabbed her. Every morning, she had nothing to do but sit alone with her game. In the afternoon, more kids crowded into the day room, and some days many of them arrived sopping wet. A girl explained that the firemen aimed powerful hoses at the children. Surging water spun them off their feet and down the street. They got up and kept marching anyway, until they too were sent to jail. By Audrey's 5th day in detention, the police could not squeeze in one more person. "We filled up all the rooms." Audrey practically jumped up and down. She was so proud. Watching TV in the day room, she saw black people stroll straight into the stores and restaurants like they belonged there. No one else could be sent to jail. Things had changed. After 7 days, Audrey went home. Her mom and daddy wrapped their arms so tight around her that they washed the jail right off of her. And for dinner, hot rolls, baptized in butter. 2 months later, the city of Birmingham wiped segregation laws clean off the books. Audrey licked her spoon clean at Newberry's ice cream counter, just like everybody else. Black and white together, we belong. The author's notes about who Audrey was. Every day, Audrey Faye Hendricks spent in jail. Her mama Lola called someone she knew to make sure her daughter was safe. The day after her release, Audrey returned to Mrs. Will's class. She didn't even tell her classmates about marching or going to jail. "It didn't even dawn on me that it was that big of a deal," she said later, but it was. Audrey was one of more than 3,000 children who were arrested in Birmingham, Alabama in May 1963. The Children's March, which was planned by Reverend James Bevel, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., affected not only Birmingham, but America. That summer, young people held protests in nearly 200 cities. President John F. Kennedy spoke on TV about prejudice and sent a civil rights bill to Congress. On August 28th, about 250,000 people marched in Washington, D.C. to hear Dr. King preach about his dream of freedom. "I had the honor of talking with Audrey in her home where she grew up," says the author. "She showed me the table at which Dr. King blessed their meals and the upright piano where she practiced the civil rights songs. Audrey told me she remained an activist afterward. She volunteered to integrate a high school, enrolling as one of its first black students. It took a while for whites and blacks to work together," she said, "but it was all that we were fighting for." After graduating from college and working in Dallas, Texas, Audrey returned to Birmingham where she taught preschool and led a Head Start program. Years later, she earned a graduate degree researching women like her mother and herself who were involved in the civil rights movement. Schools around the country invited her to speak about her experience as the youngest known marcher. She was nicknamed the Civil Rights Queen. Audrey Faye Hendricks died in 2009. A quote from Audrey in 2008. What a difference the Children's March made in our nation. The Youngest Marcher, the story of Audrey Faye Hendricks, by Cynthia Levinson and illustrated by Vanessa Brantley Newton. I'd like to invite you as a family to talk about the story that you just heard. I would invite you to think about what you might do as a young person or as a family. I would also encourage you to maybe take some time this evening and enjoy some hot buttered rolls, baptized in butter. I would invite parents, if you would like to read a book by Jennifer Harvey called Raising White Kids, Bringing Up Children in a Racially Unjust America. I received this book during a conference I attended back in October at Montreat with other folks in the Presbyterian Church who are considering what it means for us to be people of faith fighting for social justice in today's church, community, and world. Next week, we're going to be reading a book together called Let's Talk About Race by Julius Lester. I hope that you will join me in this journey this summer of learning and growing together.